Okay, let's unpack this. With Pope Francis's recent passing, the speculation, well, it's reached fever pitch, hasn't it, about who will step into his shoes.
Absolutely, it's everywhere.
But, instead of just rehashing the usual news headlines, we're taking a bit of a detour into a, frankly, intriguing corner of the internet.
Hmm.
Today, our deep dive centers on a YouTube transcript. It's from the Leo Zagami show Lazul, and it offers a decidedly different take on the potential candidates and what might really be going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, and what's fascinating straight away is that this source, it gives you a viewpoint you're probably not going to bump into in the mainstream media much.
Exactly.
It names specific people as potential successors and digs into some really compelling, if maybe unconventional, ideas about the forces at play inside the Catholic Church.
Right. So our mission today is to sort of navigate through this transcript, pull out the core arguments about the possible future of the papacy, the individuals mentioned, and, the wider implications being discussed.
And the video title itself kind of gives it away, doesn't it?
It does, hinting at a black pope and a woke direction for the church. That immediately sets the stage for the kind of analysis we're looking at here.
Right. That title immediately flags the central themes for the YouTube post. He wastes no time, puts forward two names pretty quickly, Cardinal Peter Turkson and Cardinal Wilton Daniel Gregory.
And frames them specifically like that.
Yes, specifically within this black and woke papacy context.
Okay, so let's start with Cardinal Peter Turkson then. This source really seems to position him as maybe a leading possibility.
He does.
He's from Ghana, so African, which immediately lines up with that black pope idea in the title. But the analysis, it goes much deeper than just race, right?
Oh, definitely.
Hmm.
What stands out is the source's interpretation of his connections, his background. It highlights, for example, that he has a page on the World Economic Forum website. And the YouTube host immediately jumps on that, linking it to Klaus Schwab and what he calls the mafia of Davos. It's that sort of connection that fuels the analysis.
Okay, and here's where it gets really interesting. The transcript suggests Turkson is seen as favorable to both Masonry and Jesuits. Now, for many people listening, that might sound like an unusual pairing. Complex history there.
It is an unusual pairing to flag. And what's crucial to grasp here is the underlying perspective of the YouTube host. He clearly sees these groups, rightly or wrongly. That's his view as significant, maybe even dominant influencers within the Vatican.
Right, so that lens shapes his whole interpretation of the candidates.
Exactly.
Now, looking at Turkson's actual official roles, he's been Chancellor of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences and the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences. So these are essentially high-level Vatican bodies focused on research, thought leadership on scientific, social issues. That suggests a background with an emphasis on, intellectual inquiry, social concern.
And that's a key point. In today's world, the church is grappling with some really complex scientific and social challenges. So a background like that could certainly be seen as valuable by whoever is involved in choosing the next pope.
And get this, he was appointed archbishop way back in 1992 by Pope John Paul II, became a cardinal in 2003. So he's not a newcomer. He's a long-standing figure in the hierarchy.
Decades of experience.
Yet, and this is the interesting part, despite other African bishops often being seen as more, let's say, theologically conservative, this source describes Turkson as leaning left.
Yeah, and this really underscores that the source's analysis isn't just about ethnicity. That's just one piece. The perceived ideology, that's a huge factor in their assessment.
So the fact that he's seen as liberal, despite maybe other expectations, is central to the argument here.
Absolutely, central.
Okay, and he also served as the first prefect of the dicastery for promoting integral human development. Now, a dicastery is basically like a department in the Vatican.
That's a good way to put it, yeah, a major department.
And this one, created by Pope Francis, deals with a huge range of critical issues. Migration, poverty, healthcare, even the Vatican's COVID-19 response, it seems.
A very broad portfolio. And what's fascinating is the direct line the YouTube host draws. He argues that Turkson's leadership there, in that dicastery, directly implies a welcoming stance towards migrants and just a generally liberal future direction for the church if he were elected pope.
Right, so that role is seen as proof of a certain agenda.
According to this source, yes.
Now, the other name that comes up prominently is Cardinal Wilton Daniel Gregory, an American. Former Archbishop of Washington. And the source makes a specific point of noting he's described as a friend of Barack Hussein Obama.
Yes, and again, you see the pattern, don't you? The source emphasizes the Pope of color aspect. drawing that clear parallel with Turkson.
Right.
And then mentioning the connection to a major Democratic figure in the U.S.
Right.
Well, it just further reinforces the woke narrative that the YouTube host is trying to build.
Okay, so according to this particular source, these two are the main contenders, Turkson and Gregory. But then the video takes a pretty dramatic turn, arguing that Pope Francis was, in a way, the last pope, as we've traditionally understood the role. That's a bold claim.
It is a very bold claim, and the reasoning given is quite specific. The source points to a document called the Bishop of Rome, published by the Dicastery for Promoting Christian Unity back on June 13th, 2024.
June 13th, 2024.
Okay, and the argument is that this document acts like a time bomb with really significant implications for the next pope's authority.
A time bomb. That certainly grabs your attention. So what's the argument? How does this document supposedly change the fundamental nature of the papacy?
Well, the contention is that this document basically diminishes the historical primacy, the authority that the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, has traditionally held over other Christian denominations.
So like a downgrading.
Kind of, yeah. Imagine a CEO suddenly being referred to as just, I don't know, a senior manager. That's the sort of demotion in status this document allegedly implies. The source suggests the next pope might primarily just be known as the Bishop of Rome, signaling a really major shift.
Wow. So if the traditional power and status of the pope are potentially being sort of dismantled,
Yeah.
what's the bigger picture here according to this YouTube video? What's the end game?
The source connects this to a broader move towards a unified Christian church, and even posits the possibility of a future one-world religion.
Right.
Now, this kind of theory, it often pops up in discussions that take a more, let's say, unconventional view of global events and religious trends.
It's a significant leap in interpretation, for sure. Now, what about all the other names? The ones circulating in more mainstream chats. The Italian cardinals, Zuppi, people like that. Various European figures. This source seems to just dismiss them pretty quickly.
That's right. Italian candidates like Zuppi, just deemed impossible. Several other prominent cardinals from Europe, America, Tegel, Parolin, Erdo, Uele, Prevost, names you might hear.
Yeah, familiar names.
They're dismissed for various reasons, either too white, according to the source, or not influential enough, or maybe lacking the right connections in the eyes of this particular host.
So even Cardinal Fridolin and Bongo Basongru, he seems like someone who might fit some criteria.
He gets a brief mention,
Yeah.
but ultimately considered unlikely by the source, too.
So in this narrative, it really just boils down to Turkson or Gregory.
Pretty much.
And the driving forces behind these potential selections, as the source sees it, Jesuits and Freemasonry, mentioned again and again.
Yes, these two groups are consistently painted as the primary influencers, not just in who might become pope, but in the whole direction the church is heading.
Right.
Pope Francis is described as the first Jesuit pope, and the expectation, according to this source, is that his successor, Turkson or Gregory, will continue a woke, politically liberal agenda that aligns with the interests of these groups.
It's a very specific and, I guess for many, controversial interpretation of events. And then there's the mention of Nostradamus.
Ah, yes, Nostradamus.
Apparently a Daily Mail article gets referenced, drawing connections between his prophecies and the next pope.
And what's interesting there is how the YouTube host interprets these, centuries-old prophecies.
How so?
The mention of a younger, dark-skinned man who will supposedly impact the finances of someone associated with the color red, well, that's taken as more evidence supporting the idea of a non-white pope taking over.
Right. It's certainly a way to weave together different, maybe disparate pieces of information into one narrative.
It creates a compelling narrative, absolutely, especially if you're already leaning that way.
The video also briefly touches on the agreement between the Vatican and Communist China. How does that fit into this analysis?
Well, including the Vatican-China agreement suggests the host sees a much broader global political context influencing the church.
Not just internal church stuff.
Exactly. It implies that geopolitics, beyond just internal church dynamics, are also playing a role in shaping the future direction, the leadership of the Catholic Church.
Okay. And then we have the perspective of Vigano. The source describes him as excommunicated. His views on Pope Francis are, apparently, highly critical.
Very critical. The source highlights Vigano's strong belief that Pope Francis's theological positions are, in his view, heretical.
Heretical. Strong word.
Very. It even quotes Vigano referencing Eugenio Scalfari's claims about the Pope's views on the afterlife. And Vigano, according to this transcript, believes the next conclave, the next Pope, will likely just continue down this path,
Pushing further.
first advancing the agenda towards this idea of a one-world religion.
So a pretty bleak outlook from Vigano, at least as presented here. Now, one of the more striking claims, and definitely controversial, it concerns the alleged communist roots of the Jesuits.
Yes, this is a particularly provocative point the YouTube host makes. He references a specific painting. Apparently, it's in a major Jesuit church in Rome.
Okay, what does it show?
It supposedly depicts Jesus holding a red flag alongside St. Ignatius, the founder of the Jesuit.
A red flag. Okay.
And this image is presented as, essentially, evidence, proof that the woke direction being attributed to the Jesuits isn't some new thing, but actually has historical roots, connections to communist ideologies within the order itself.
Wow. That's a powerful and certainly debatable interpretation of a piece of historical artwork.
Highly debatable, yes.
And finally, the host of the YouTube show, he mentions a personal connection to the Jesuit order.
Yeah, he claims a cousin, Carlos Edelnate Line, was actually a teacher and mentor to Pope Francis.
Really?
That's the claim. Now, whether that's verifiable or not is one thing, but that personal anecdote, it serves to add a kind of layer of perceived insider knowledge to the whole narrative. Makes it sound more authoritative, perhaps.
Right? Adds a bit of flavor, maybe some credibility in the eyes of his audience. Okay, so having taken this deep dive into this very specific YouTube transcript, what would you say are the core takeaways based purely on this particular source?
Well, if we synthesize the information just from this transcript, the source strongly argues that the most probable successor to Pope Francis, according to its analysis, is either Cardinal Peter Turkson or Cardinal Wilton Daniel Gregory.
Okay, Turkson or Gregory.
And both are seen as fitting into this perceived black and woke direction for the Catholic Church. That's the key framing.
And the broader implications, beyond just who gets the job, what does the source suggest?
The argument is pretty fundamental. It's that the traditional role, the authority of the Pope itself, is undergoing a massive shift, a dismantling almost, potentially leading to a future where the Bishop of Rome holds a much diminished status within a perhaps more unified global religious landscape.
And influenced heavily by.
Influenced significantly, according to this source, by Jesuit and Freemasonic agendas.
Right. Well, considering the unique perspectives presented in this YouTube transcript, it certainly gives you some food for thought, doesn't it?
It definitely does.
How might the selection of a pope of color and this potential shift in the papacy's authority, as described here, impact the global perception, the future of the Catholic Church? And, I mean, what are the potential ramifications if there's any substance to these claims about a move towards a one-world religion?
Big questions. Huge implications if any of it holds water.
It's definitely a lot to process. This deep dive has offered a, let's say, distinctive, certainly controversial viewpoint. And we'd encourage you, listening, to consider these points and continue your own exploration into the complex dynamics around the papal succession and forces, whatever they may be, potentially shaping the future of religious institutions.